Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Neufeld. Today is the first episode in May, and instead of doing some things from the news, we're going to do something I'm calling a Reddit roundup. So I looked at some of the top posts on Reddit, including some questions asked, and I'm going to go through some of those and look for some things that you could keep in mind if it relates to your situation. Before we get into the episode today, I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to a couple of listeners who left really kind reviews on Apple Podcasts recently about some of their favorite episodes. Both were from episodes that I wasn't entirely sure that people would actually enjoy. And so the fact that you went out of your way to leave me a review, that feels pretty good. And I'm glad that you really enjoyed those ones. Leaving a review and a rating on the show will also help other people find the show through their podcast player of choice. So if you have listened to the show for a while, and if you like it, if you could be so kind as to leave a positive review and a rating on the show, that would be great. Thank you very much. All right, today I wanted to talk a little bit about some topics that are new and noteworthy, kind of like I do on the first episode of every month. However, I have to record this episode a little bit in advance because I'm going to be traveling. So instead of running the risk of reporting on some news that'll be no longer news by the time this episode comes out, I thought it would be interesting to go through Reddit and some of the personal finance pages there, find some top questions or posts from the last month, and kind of walk through those, explain a few concepts, maybe debunk a few of the top comments if necessary. But yeah, let's get into those. The first post here, all of these are Canadian, by the way, so I'm not going to be talking about anything that's American related necessarily, but this first one says the title is RRSP account is at $999,000. Congratulations to this user. That's pretty great. They say in the post, I turned 50 this year and it seems my RRSP will finally crack $1 million. In my 20s, I did start investing small amounts annually, but around age 30, I was starting to make decent money, about $100K annually, and went to the bank to get a $35,000 RRSP loan to catch up on my contribution room. I'll come back and explain all these things, by the way. I'm just going to read the post. Of course, then I had to pay off the loan, some of which I did with that big tax return. Anyway, I tell the story to those people reading this they call it a subreddit, who haven't yet started investing seriously and think, what's the point, or I'm too late. Also to mention that if I had not done the catch-up loan, I may not have stuck with it. It can be discouraging seeing small amounts in your retirement account and lackluster growth. Making progress encourages you to keep it up. I don't think I've always been great with money in general, but after that catch-up loan, I prioritized maxing my RRSP consistently, and now I've got a reasonable nest egg. I don't really hear people talk about the strategy much on this sub. Anyways, it helped kids start my investing journey. Cool. So my goal here is to kind of walk through a few concepts, explain how those work, just so that there's no misunderstandings for you as a listener, or if you had read that post and you had thought about yourself as well. So first things first here, some key things. 1, recently turned 50. 2, it's worth, let's just round it up. He's saying it's $999,000. Let's call it $1 million. Number 3, 20 years ago, did an RRSP loan to put some money in there. 3, credits the loan with some forced savings, even a mentality shift, but also just getting a lot of money invested in there in the first place. And then the last point that I want to make here, just for some context, is that many of the comments, if you go through there, are equating that catch-up loan or the loan itself as the way to potentially build $1 million RRSP. Now, let's get into some things that are worth discussing here. The main concept that I wanted to address in this case was the idea of leverage. I've done an episode about that relatively recently, but the idea of leverage is just the fact that you are borrowing money, so it's money that you don't have, but you're borrowing money to invest elsewhere. When you borrow money, there's a cost, and that cost is called interest. And just because this was called an RRSP loan, it's kind of glazing over or maybe like whitewashing the fact that this is literally just a leverage play. You're just borrowing money to invest. It doesn't have to be an RRSP. You could do that in your TFSA or something else too. It just doesn't have the commonly understood language of RRSP loan. So when you borrow money to invest, it kind of exposes you to a new set of risks and introduces some cost to investing as well. So when you borrow money to invest in an RRSP and you have an interest cost associated with that loan, that interest cannot be deducted against your income. In some cases it can, but not with an RSP, not with a TFSA. Okay, so you cannot deduct the interest when you make a loan of this type. In many cases, these interest rates are going to be variable and they're tied to the prime rate. And so now, over the last 12 months or so, we've seen prime go from about 2.3 up to about 6.7. So if you're borrowing money to invest, your cost of borrowing has just gone up exponentially in the last 12 months. So this is a risk. I call that interest rate risk. Then when you invest that money, you're at the whims of whatever the market does. So if the market goes up, that's great. If the market goes down, too bad. But when you're leveraging, you always owe that same amount of money back. So if the market always goes straight up, of course, you'd always want to borrow as much money as you possibly could and invest it. But the reality is that's not the case. So you have interest rate risk, you have market risk. And in this case, because you'll typically have to make payments on the interest, you also have an income reduction or income loss risk there that could be a challenge, where now you just have an additional payment, much like a car payment would be or something like that. So I'm just talking about the pitfalls here, but of course it can work. But the idea that it's called an RRSP loan distracts many people from the fact that this is just borrowing money to invest and has nothing to do with the fact that it's specifically invested in an RRSP in this case. But for him, or for this poster, I'm glad it panned out. When you borrow money to invest in an RRSP account, you still get the tax deduction from the contribution. And so there can be some offsetting benefit there a little bit as well. But for many people, especially those who are new to investing, I can't recommend that leverage is the way to get started. Investing out of your cash flow is a really great way to do it. And especially if you're someone who's prone to selling at the wrong time. So if something declines in value and you want to sell it and do things like that, RRSP loans, borrowing to invest, leverage in general is not going to be a great option for you. But for this person, it seemed to work great. Next thing that I wanted to discuss here has to do with the fact that an RRSP eventually turns into something else. The way I explain it to clients is usually that an RRSP is a bucket, but at age 71, your bucket has a hole in it, and you have to take money out of it starting around that time. So at age 71, you have to convert your RRSP to something called an RRIF. We call it a RRIF. That stands for Registered Retirement Income Fund. And like I said before, this is your leaky bucket. So there's a minimum amount that you have to start withdrawing from that account. Your first minimum payment has to come out the following year. So you convert your RRSP to a RRIF at 71, and you don't have to take your minimum until the end of the year in which you turn 72. So if you really don't want that income, you can kind of get cute with it and take the money out pretty well a year later if you want to do it that way. But let's do some hypothetical math here with this guy's account. So he's 50 years old, has $1 million RRSP, 21 years from now. Let's say he's relatively conservative with his investments. Probably not if he's got $1 million in RRSP at age 50, but let's say a 4% return from now for the next 21 years. Rough math puts that about $2.3 million at age 71. And so now back to the idea of withdrawing minimums from the account. At age 71, your minimum withdrawal is right around 5.3% of the total account per year. You can spread that out monthly. You can do it annually in a lump sum, whatever the case is. That's probably a topic for a podcast another day. But at a $2.3 million account, the minimum withdrawal at that point is $90,000. That's a lot. And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to just do a little bit of a projection using a rough inflation calculation. So most provinces, their tax brackets adjust pretty well 1-to-1 with inflation. CPP and OAS also do that. So simple exercise here. I wanted to see that where the tax bracket thresholds would end up at the same period of time, plus approximate CPP and OAS payments, to see what kind of tax situation someone with this size of account would find themselves in. So in Ontario, my projection with inflation is that in 20 years, that middle tax bracket, before you have a huge jump up in tax rates, will probably be pretty close to $158,000. Anything below that, you pay about a third of your income in tax. But for this person, having a $90,000 minimum plus what I figure would be about $24,000 in CPP and about $11,000 in old age security, you have $125,000 of income. So you're still firmly in that middle tax bracket. just with your minimums that you have to take out of this account. So if you take anything more than that out of your RRIF, because again, your RRIF is just a leaky bucket, there's no lid on the top. You can take out as much as you want. It just counts as income when you take it. So the idea with an RSP, right, is that you wanted to contribute in a high bracket, withdraw in a low bracket. But in this person's case, because they've done so well with it, just the minimum amount of money that you'll have to take out of that at age 71 is very likely to keep them in that middle tax bracket. So for people that are what I would call super savers, or people that save a good percentage of their income, or people that maximize their RSPs every year, I really, really recommend that for people that are above the middle tax bracket in your province to avoid situations like this. Again, this isn't a problem. I'm going to file this under good problems, but the net benefit of an RSP is minimized if you contribute in the middle tax bracket and withdraw in the middle tax bracket. So if you're not a big spender and you're saving a really good chunk of your income and you're not necessarily having a really high income, you could find yourself in the bizarre scenario where you might end up paying more on the way out than what you received on the way in as far as the tax benefit goes. So lots of considerations here necessarily, but that is something that you want to be aware of when you invest in RSP, especially if that's the primary account that you're using to save. Again, wouldn't that be an awesome problem to have, that everybody's got $2.5 million in their RSPs by the time they retire? Anyways, just something to think about there for the future anyways. So what do you do about that? Well, what happens when you retire? Well, you'll probably start withdrawing that money before age 71, assuming you retire before that. Having an income strategy for all your different account types can be really important depending on what you prioritize. So if your priority is spending the most money while you're alive, if it's leaving the most to your kids, if it's paying the least amount of taxes, your strategy could look very, very different. So working with a planner can be really valuable, especially for someone like this who's saved so well throughout their working years that they're potentially going to run into some tax problems, but some planning opportunities to make sure that their priorities can still be met. So part of that spending strategy could be spending your RSP accounts first, or even starting to withdraw a little bit in your last working years. Maybe I see it happen all the time where people start reducing their workload, which thereby reduces their income. So starting to withdraw a little bit from your RSP, especially after 65, when you can split that amount with your spouse. That's another topic for another day, but you can start to get creative with these withdrawals after age 65 in particular, if you have a spouse. But by spending that money down, it prevents a couple of things from happening. The one thing that most people don't understand is how these things are taxed upon death. So I'll briefly mention that here. So if you have an RSP or a RRIF, again, your bucket with a hole in it, doesn't matter. It's treated the same way if you pass away. If you have a spouse, it can roll over to them. Essentially, the name just changes and it's now theirs. However, if you don't have a spouse or if they've predeceased you, you can still name a beneficiary. So maybe your kids, you can name a friend, you can do whatever. You might not want to do that, or you want to think twice at the very least about that, because what happens is they would receive the whole value of your account, but your estate would be left with the tax bill as if every dollar in that account was income in that year. So for this person who's posting about $1 million, say this happens, say they're a single person and they've got $1 million in there. What happens is that $1 million is treated like income in the year that they pass away. In most provinces, that gets pretty close to 50%. And so there'd be a tax bill owing of at least $500,000, and the other half is left. So again, back to my previous conversation about the RRIF minimums and them probably being in the middle tax bracket at least. The middle tax bracket for most provinces is like 30 to 33%-ish. So spending that money first, again, with a good plan and strategy and whatnot, this isn't universal, but in many cases, you can withdraw and spend that money and pay 33% on it instead of kicking the tax can down the road and potentially passing away with a large balance there and having it inadvertently be taxed at 50% after you've passed. Again, all depends on what your priorities are, but in many cases like this, starting to spend down that RSP it's a good plan. Anyways, that's all the thoughts that I had on this post here. So just some things to consider for people that have unusually high RSP balances. Good problems. Okay, next is another post from Reddit, and the title is 90K tax bill to CRA as self-employed, invested that money and down 80%. Options? Okay, I was going to title this podcast No Dumb Questions, and so I really do believe that. So if I come across as sarcastic or anything like that, that's unintentional here, because this person, they lead off with this post by saying, I'm caught in a tough spot with no one to blame but myself. Okay, good awareness to start off with. But let me read through part of the post here. So, caught in a tough spot, nobody to blame but myself. I owe $90,000 to CRA after doing my tax return for 2022. I invested all of the tax money last year and was doing fairly good until I discovered options trading and blew it all within 2 weeks. I know it was a bad decision, but I'm wondering what my options are now, no pun intended. I would be able to pay this back in 9 months based on my current financials. Anyone dealt with this situation before would appreciate any advice on how to navigate this. Okay, so there's some concepts here that we need to probably go over, but we saw this a lot during the crypto crash in particular last year, because people kind of thought that crypto was, like play money. But as far as CRA is concerned, that involves real taxes owing. So what happened with a lot of people in crypto is they'd be trading a lot of coins and things like that. So if you found something that was worth fractions of a penny and then it was ended up worth a couple of bucks, well, you might have been up thousands of a percent or something like that, just on a pretty wild speculative bet. And then you sell it and you buy something else, and you sell it and you buy something else. But what you're doing in that case is that you're incurring capital gains along the way. But then if you're something else that you go to, eventually you hit a brick wall and the thing goes to zero. Well, if you haven't been setting aside tax money according to all the capital gains that you'd been incurring along the way, you will be in a situation just like this person where you owe a bunch of tax money, but you don't have the assets then to be able to pay it. In his case, he was trading options. And if you don't know what those are, I won't get into it today, but you're kind of like making bets on different stocks, whether they go up or go down. When used correctly, options can act like insurance. When used incorrectly, options can be used like leverage, and they can be used to inadvertently blow up your account. So it seems like he was not using options as an insurance against his overall portfolio, but as a way to speculate on movements of the market. So now what, right? So the question is, has anyone dealt with this before? Would appreciate any advice on how to navigate this. Well, first and foremost, if you have a $90,000 bill to CRA, they are going to want their money, and you best be reaching out to them with a payment plan. Thankfully, I have not had to deal with this myself, but my understanding is that CRA is actually pretty willing to work with you as long as you present something that's reasonable, and you can come up with a payment plan to them. The problem with that is that CRA charges you interest, and lots of it. Currently, the prescribed rate of interest that CRA charges on money owed to them is 9%. That's not nothing. So in this person's case, 9% on an annual basis is $8,100. However, it's actually much worse than that, because interest owed to CRA is compounded daily. So you take that 9% divided by 365, and that fraction of a percent every single day that you owe them money gets compounded on it. So this is the beauty of compounding, but this is the ugly head of compounding, I guess, because it works against you when you owe money as well. So in this case, if he just left the $90,000 bill sitting there all year, it's actually $8,475 because of the daily compounding of money owed to CRA. So the rate is high, the compounding is very frequent. This can really get people in trouble. So you want to pay them back as soon as possible. You want to contact them as soon as possible, telling them that you'll do that, because if you bury your head in the sand here with CRA and just wait for them to contact you or things like that, that doesn't mean that they don't know about you, because depending on how long you delay or things like that, they can take legal action against you. They can garnish your wages. There's all sorts of different things that they can do to recoup their money. The CRA is an enemy that you do not want. Okay, so how do you avoid this? Well, first thing, if you owe this much, you listener, but also this person that's posting, if you owe $90,000 to CRA, either you have a very profitable new business or you have unusually high income this year or something like that. Because what typically happens is that if you owe money to CRA for multiple years in a row, what happens is they'll say, okay, you got to start paying your taxes quarterly instead of waiting for this massive bill when you file at the end of April. So in my case, personally, I have to pay taxes quarterly, and that gets recalculated every year based on your approximate income last year. And they'll tell you exactly what it is. So these are called quarterly installments. And so this person is perhaps new to this or missed their quarterlies, which is also a problem because you can be charged interest on missed quarterly payments. Now, that's more complicated and outside of the scope of this podcast here. But if you have installments, pay them and pay them on time. That's the first thing on a way to avoid this. Number two, if you don't have installments calculated or required, but think you will, but like think you're going to owe tax, set aside money in a different bank account than your personal bank account or your personal savings account, so it's ready to go for tax time. This person was taking that like to the other end of the spectrum of like not only setting it aside, but setting it aside into like the most speculative part of the investing world. Don't do that, obviously. Never invest your tax money because it's not yours, right? If you had a regular job, if you had regular employment income, you never would have seen that money in the first place. That is a good thing because stuff like this can happen. So the way that I get around this is I typically do most of my banking through TD. Doesn't matter who you bank with, but that's who my day-to-day banking is with. But I also have a lot of savings accounts with Tangerine. Again, I'm not vouching for any of them necessarily, but this is just what I do. So when I get paid, I calculate an approximate tax that I'm going to owe on how much I get paid, and I transfer that money over to my business and taxes account over at Tangerine, which is a regular old savings account, but I just call it that so I remember what it's for. And that money is not mine. That is CRA's, and it sits there until I need it to pay my taxes every quarter. For me, that's a good system. Hasn't really got me in trouble before. I've had some scenarios where I haven't calculated it properly and I've been a little bit short, so you have to kind of rob Peter to pay Paul a little bit and move some stuff around. But generally speaking, it works pretty well for me. Now that if you have quarterly payments, it gets even easier because you can kind of do your calculation based on that. That doesn't mean you won't owe more at the end of the year, but it'll get you in pretty good shape. You won't run into a situation where you owe $90,000 out of nowhere. If you think your taxes owing are going to be different than your quarterly installments, you can talk to your accountant. If you have quarterly installments, also have an accountant. That's probably a good rule of thumb, but talk to them and they can recalculate it for you so that you won't find yourself in this trouble. But if you don't want to do that, you can also put your best guess income into a income tax calculator and find your average tax rate and say it's 30%, say it's 40%, whatever, and then just set aside that money and you're going to get pretty close. These are like pretty simple ways that you can avoid running into this. And obviously the overarching theme here is that you never want to invest money that is owed to the CRA. One of the top comments here says, get an accountant, explain the situation to them, follow the accountant's advice. Unfortunately, while you should have an accountant, they're also going to just tell you you're going to need to set up a payment plan with CRA. If you were missing some sort of deductions or whatever, they can maybe help out with that. But an accountant is not going to be able to finagle your way out of a tax bill like this, especially if it's self-employment income. Yeah, accountants are not miracle workers, but they will hopefully be able to set you up in advance for next year to avoid problems like this. Okay, moving on to the last one, and this is a little bit more lighthearted, but especially with inflation as high as it has been, many people are looking for ways to save money, and this isn't saving a couple bucks here and there. It's like, oh my goodness, my lifestyle is like 10%, 20% more expensive depending on what you're doing. How can I actually save money out there? And one way that I still see popping up all the time is Costco. And the question from this post was, does Costco actually save you money? The post says, I'm debating on joining the dark side, meaning getting a Costco membership. Does anyone have any tips of shopping smartly at Costco? I feel like it's an easy place to get carried away shopping, but you can save money on your monthly grocery bill if you're disciplined. Thoughts? Yeah, I've got some thoughts. I think Costco is great for some people and terrible for other people. It's kind of a running joke with anybody that shops there. It's like, if you can actually get out of Costco spending less than $200, you maybe did something wrong. It's like, it is very easy to spend a very high absolute dollar amount there, because you're buying everything in such large quantities that, yes, the cost per unit of whatever you're buying, like the cost per gram or the cost per steak or the cost per box or whatever it is you're buying, is really cheap compared to most other options, but the absolute dollar cost is quite high. So if it's something that you're not burning through on a regular basis, something that's not actually something you need a high quantity of, Costco is actually a way to spend way more money than you typically would. But if you're buying things like, in my case, I've got little kids at home, and it's very easy for them to burn through strawberries and blackberries and raspberries and all those kind of things that the kids love to eat. And buying at Costco is way cheaper. It actually blew my mind when we started shopping at Costco again, once we had kids. Diapers, big things like that you're going to go through a lot of. Toilet paper, paper towel, all that kind of stuff is great for shopping at Costco. So I would say, does Costco actually save you money? I'm going to say yes and no, but let's kind of walk through that a little bit. So first things first, you have to buy a membership. So you have to pay money to walk in the door, which is a fantastic business model for if you are a shareholder of Costco. Yeah, so that is a cost. It's not massive. I think it's $55 or $60 or something like that. Then you can get an executive membership, I think. That's probably double that cost, but it allows you to get a certain percentage of your spending as a rebate every year. It's not huge, but depending on how much money you spend there, it could be worth it. For the last 5 years, every time, it has not been worth it based on our spending at Costco. But now that we've got kids and we're buying all those things that I mentioned before, diapers and infinite amounts of berries, yeah, it actually made sense for us to upgrade our membership this year, because then we can save a little bit on the rebate. So that is a consideration. So the membership. Second one is that volume play. So if you don't have storage, Costco might be more of a pain than anything. So we used to live in a basement suite, and we just couldn't reasonably shop at Costco because we didn't have room to store all the big sizes of anything. Another thing was that we're just two people, and buying all of the produce and fruit and things like that at Costco wasn't a great option for us because we couldn't eat it fast enough. Maybe I just like too much variety. Maybe I didn't want to eat the same thing constantly, but we found that we were throwing away a lot of food because it would go bad by the time we could get to it. So if you're just a single person or maybe a couple, it might be hard to use Costco to save money if you're ending up throwing out a lot of food. Next one, bringing a list, because this store has everything and they bring in new stuff all the time. And so just browsing through the aisles, it is very easy to say, oh, that's nice and it's cheap. Yeah, let's do that. So if you are going to Costco without a list, buckle up, because that is not a great way to save money. But if you know exactly what you're there for, it can be great. So bring a list. If cost saving actually isn't a priority, they've got great new stuff all the time, and it's fun to try new things or new foods or whatever the case may be. But if your goal is to save money, you got to bring a list and plan in advance before you walk in the door. They'll also hand you a flyer almost every single time that you walk in there with some of the things that are on sale. Their sales can be pretty good, so take a look at some of those things if you can substitute what you were planning to come for, or just make sure that the things you're looking for, perhaps they're on sale, or maybe something you might need in the future is on a really good price. That could be a good thing to take a look at there. Another big way that we've used Costco to save money over the years is buying our tires there. So we live in a part of the country where winter tires are very useful. And so buying tires there, I haven't always bought them on rims before, so you have to do the seasonal changeover. Their seasonal changeovers are very cheap, way cheaper. I would say maybe a third of the price of a bigger chain like Cal Tire or something like that. But they recently changed it so they will not do seasonal changeovers if you have not purchased your tires there. So if you've already saved money on buying your tires there, which you can also do online, which is great, then you can do your changeover while you're shopping there. You could save yourself a few $100 a year, no problem. If you're in a situation like that where you have to buy tires and change them over a couple times a year, Costco can be a way to save hundreds of bucks right there. Last way that we've been able to use Costco to save money is by actually buying something else, which you can get at Costco, buying a vacuum sealer and a deep freeze. So we don't have a massive deep freeze, but it's relatively small. It wasn't very expensive, but buying a vacuum sealer and a deep freeze has allowed us to buy more things at Costco to save more money. So things like meat in particular, meat's gone up in price like crazy. And so buying meat at Costco and then packaging it up and vacuum sealing it allows us to use it over a longer period of time without it getting freezer burned, staying fresh longer. These vacuum sealers are not expensive and the bags are not that expensive either. We've definitely made up that cost by being able to use frozen food longer. On the other end, too, if you are into meal prepping, you can prep higher volumes of food at once and then freeze the leftovers in the vacuum sealer. And that way you can actually save a bunch of time later on as well, too. So it cuts down on your food prep time throughout the week. It saves you on cost because you can buy in higher volumes, and it saves you in cost again because you're probably not throwing out leftovers because you can put them in the freezer because you vacuum sealed them. Anyways, maybe I should have another podcast about food and things like that. I really like cooking and trying new foods and all that sort of thing. So anyways, this one was up my alley here a little bit. So can you actually save money at Costco? I would say definitely yes and definitely no. The people that probably can save money at Costco are people that have storage in their house, that have more than 2 people in the household. But if you're a single person that lives in a condo, I would say Costco's probably not going to be a place that you're going to be able to save a whole lot of money. Maybe a little bit here and there, but probably just enough to offset your membership cost per year. But if you have kids, I would strongly take a look at Costco from time to time and see if you can save some money on the things that you'd be buying anyways. All right, that is it for the Reddit roundup today. This was kind of fun, so I'll probably try doing this again in the future. But thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. Any rates of return or investments discussed are historical or hypothetical and are intended to be used for educational purposes only. You should always consult with your financial, legal, and tax advisors before making changes to your financial plan. Evan Neufeld is a certified financial planner and registered investment fund advisor. Mutual funds and ETFs are provided by Sterling Mutuals, Inc.